Greg looked awkward when I found him at the bar, but he smiled and said, "There you are, buddy. How about grabbing a picture and sitting in a booth?" Sitting down, we chatted for a few minutes about the Reds, and whether they had any chance this season. We concluded that third place was the best they could hope for. About the latest political scandal, the mayor's chief of staff and the treasurer of the Catholic Diocese of Cincinnati used the services of the same call girl. At least the story was original. And about the latest office gossip at Brockton Publishing, where he was a colleague of my wife, Susan. But I knew Greg had something on his mind, some reason why he was asking me to meet him for a beer. In the end, I just said, "So, Greg, what did you want to talk to me about?" There was a short silence, during which Greg looked more nervous than ever. He cleared his throat and falls started several times. Then he said, "Look, Andy," Susan said, she told me that." I just waited. His eyes were fixed on my face, and I had no idea what he was going to say. "Susan said I should never mention it in front of you, that you'd rather keep it a secret. So forgive me if I'm doing it wrong, you know. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. It's just I need to be sure you're really okay with it, with what I asked, still not understanding what this was about." He licked his lips, looking unhappy. "You know, with the game you and Susan are playing where he made an uncertain gesture with his hands, and his voice broke as he looked at me, begging me to somehow finish his sentence. "I'm sorry, Greg," I said. "I still don't understand you." There was a long silence. Greg stared at me, and I swear I saw him go pale. I waited again, gesturing for him to continue, and finally, grudgingly, he said, "Andy, don't you know about Susan, how to having fun with other guys?" Greg had joined Susan at Brockton Publishing about a year earlier, having left a lower position at a New York publishing house to come to Cincinnati. He was about 28 years old, about 10 years younger than Susan and me. Greg was a large, stately fellow, attractive in his own way. He was single, but didn't seem to have any trouble finding female companionship. In fact, I'd seen him at book parties in Brockton with several attractive women. Of course, he met Susan first because they worked together, but I really liked him. After discovering that we had common interests in baseball, which bored Susan to tears, we went to a couple Reds games the previous summer and really enjoyed ourselves. We also worked out at the same gym, and from time to time, Susan and I would take him out to dinner. He was a nice guy, and I enjoyed his company. Now, however, I could feel my face reddening with anger, and I said quietly, "Greg, what the hell are you talking about?" Greg recoiled from me to the other side of the stall. He was bigger than me by 4 inches and 30 pounds, but he looked absolutely terrified. "Andy, I swear to God she told me it was a game you were playing. This is unbelievable, dude." He motioned to get up from the stall, but I put my hand on his shoulder. "Hang in there, Greg." I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep my voice down. "I'll be on my best behavior. I promise, and I'm not going to hit you or anything, but you can't just walk out of here. You have to tell me what the hell Susan told you." He nodded and sat back down heavily. "Okay, Andy, it's just, God, I can't believe you don't know about this." I stared at him, my thoughts whirling past. "Susan told me that you two are playing the game, that you both get turned on by the idea of her having fun with other guys and then coming home and telling you about it. And she said that part of the game was total secrecy. None of the men she had sex with were supposed to mention it. There was no way we were to talk about having sex with her or that you knew anything about it. According to her, part of the high for the two of you was to pretend it was a secret affair. She made me swear I'd never say a word to you about it. But I just couldn't do it, Andy. It seemed so damn weird to me, and I had to double-check with you to make sure everything was really okay." He must have realized from the look on my face that I was stunned, and he looked even more miserable than before. Finally, I asked, "So you entertained Susan?" Slowly, reluctantly, he said, "Yeah, we did it twice. Once 2 weekends ago when your mom was sick and you were spending the night in Louisville, and then again on Tuesday afternoon, we took time off work and drove to my house." There was a long silence. My mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour's shock, rage, sadness, self-defeat. How the hell could I not know about this? Finally, I said, "And she convinced you that I was in on it? That I was okay with it? That it was part of the game she and I were playing?" He nodded, feeling relieved that my hands weren't around his throat. It sounded twisted, I admit, but she was so convincing. Said you guys have been playing like that for years and that you really liked it. He frowned. That's actually exactly what she said. We sat for a couple more minutes. Finally, I said, Greg, if it's not already obvious, I didn't know shit about any of this. I thought I was married to a loving, wonderful woman, not a cheater. I need to think this through. I have no idea what I'm going to do. Needless to say, it was quite a shock. I laughed wickedly. Then I leaned forward and stared at him intently. Do 2 things for me, okay? 1, don't entertain Susan anymore. Of course, Andy, I would never. Greg nodded vigorously at me. And 2nd, don't show that you've been talking to me. If she offers to me to again, just make up some excuse. I need to figure out how I'm going to handle this, and I need you to keep her completely in the dark. Greg nodded again. You have my word on that, Andy. And listen, I swear to you, I would never have touched Susan if I didn't believe that you wanted it too. You're my friend, man, and I feel like total shit. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and I didn't know what to say to him. Should I try to make him feel better, or should I grab a tire iron and beat him to death? After Greg left, I pulled myself together and called home. Luckily, Susan wasn't home yet, and I left a plausible message that I was late for work. Let her eat without me. I knew I needed time. There was no way I could meet her right away. I walked around the corner to the diner and ate a hamburger and salad without taking a bite. For all I knew, it could have been a borscht and shrimp salad sandwich. I guess I was a typical horny husband because I had no idea that there was anything wrong with my marriage. I just adored Susan and was sure she loved me. We had been married 14 years, no kids, had a cozy house near Burnett Woods, 2 jobs we enjoyed. I work in development at a university. We traveled a lot, saw friends and family, most of whom lived in the area, and generally enjoyed our life together. Susan is a short blonde with graceful curves. She's cute rather than pretty, but her figure has always attracted attention, and she seems to have always liked it. She actually flirted with me at the party where we first met, and over the years I've watched her flirt with guys at other parties we've been to, laughing and joking, dancing a little too close, or even letting someone touch herself. And it never bothered me because I knew she loved me and would go home with me. What a bloody idiot I was. I imagine our sex life was pretty average for a couple like us. We made love maybe a couple times a week, more when we were on vacation, probably almost every day, unless when we were busy at work or during the holidays when we were visiting family. It may have been a routine, but I'd say it was a satisfying routine. You would think that by the time I finished dinner I would be ready to go home and kick my cheating wife out of the house, but I wasn't ready yet. It was like hearing that a loved one had died in an accident. My mind just wasn't taking in the news. I kept thinking that this all had to be some kind of mistake, and I realized that I needed to hear the whole story from Greg. Everything Susan had told him before I could begin to digest it and figure out what the hell I should do. I felt like there was no way I could pretend to Susan that everything was okay, but somehow I managed. She greeted me affectionately, as she always did, and we chatted about our workday while I bought myself an ice cream. She even snuggled up to me in bed, though thank goodness she didn't feel like making love. I think I would have strangled her in the end. As soon as I realized from her breathing that she had fallen asleep, I gently pulled away from her and rolled to my side of the bed. I didn't even want to touch her. I had terrible dreams that night, an endless succession of men entertaining Susan. Needless to say, the night was just awful. I called Greg the next morning as soon as Susan left for work and arranged to meet him for lunch. He was a little resistant in at first, but I had no trouble explaining to him that I needed to hear the whole story. Last night I had been too shaken up to comprehend everything he had told me. After a morning spent staring at my office wall, trying and failing to focus on any aspect of my work, I met Greg at a small Greek restaurant on Calhoun Street. By mutual agreement, we ate first, and then I asked him to tell me the whole story again. From the beginning, Greg. You can probably imagine how hard it was for me to deal with last night. I didn't really learn that much new. About 3 weeks ago, Susan had a casual drink with Greg and basically proposed to him. She told him about our game and that she was attracted to him. He put it off that day, mostly because he was more stunned than anything else. It seemed like such a far-fetched story, and the thought of being a good friend and sleeping with her made him feel very uncomfortable, so he said. But they talked about it a few more times over the next few days, and when she told him on Friday that I was coming to Louisville for the weekend, he agreed to meet her at the motel. She actually suggested our house, but Greg said that idea scared him. But I asked him to tell me everything Susan had said about the game and how long it had been going on. Apparently at least a couple of years. She didn't say exactly, he told me, but I realized that she'd had several boyfriends before me. She said she'd always had one buddy, that was her word buddy, and that she'd had sex with him for a couple months before breaking up with him. She said that after a while you don't get as interested in talking to her if it's the same guy. You like to hear about someone new? He made a grimace. God, I'm so sorry. I know, Greg. She tricked you. Forget about it. Look, did she tell you anything about how it all started and who was before you? Not about how it started, he said, but she mentioned a couple guys. None of the names meant anything to me except Arnold Morrison. That guy on the city council? Yeah, Greg said. She said she met him when there was a party in Brockton for some political book they published 2 or 3 years ago. Susan also said that you never knew any of her playmates personally before me. She seems to have done that on purpose so you wouldn't have a chance to figure out what she was up to. Did she tell you why she followed you? He looked awkward again. She said I was too appetizing to resist. He covered his face with his hand for a moment. Andy, Jesus, you must want to destroy me. I feel like the lowest scum on earth. I said grimly, I don't blame you, Greg. A lot of guys would be happy to tear a chunk off Susan without giving a second thought to her husband, and she gave you that stupid story. I can't say that I wouldn't believe it either if all this had happened to me. What really matters is that Susan has been cheating on me. Apparently for years now, how much she must enjoy bullying and pulling the wool over my eyes. I sat staring into space. Greg didn't say anything. My mind was spinning with a lot of questions about what the hell I was going to do. How would I behave with Susan? Would I continue to pretend to be a loving husband and remain in complete ignorance? Will I be able to stand up to her and kick her ass out? Or will I mope around for a while and let her worry? But he already had an answer to one question. Our marriage was over. Susan was history. At least she was history if what Greg had told me was true. As shocked and furious as I was, I couldn't just drop an arrow on her without knowing for sure. I called my friend Brian and arranged to meet him for dinner. Then I left another message for Susan saying I was having dinner with Brian and would be home late that night. Brian was my oldest and best friend. We met when he was president of Zeta Beta Tau, the fraternity I joined in college. We were very close. I was best man at his wedding to Emily, and he was my best man when I married Susan. He had known Susan almost as long as I had, and I knew that he and Emily loved her very much. So he was as stunned to hear the story as I was. Brian was great, just as I expected. He let me tell it my way, asking only a few questions along the way. He was patient and supportive, even wordlessly handing me a tissue when I started crying. We're not the kind of friends who say I love you to each other, but I knew he was in my corner, and that helped a lot. When I finally finished speaking, he asked me quietly, "Do you know what you're going to do, Andy?" "2 things," I said. "I only know 2 things so far. 1, I have to be absolutely sure it's really true. I still can't believe it, you know? I mean, I was so sure Susan loved me. And another thing, if it's true, Susan is in for a very unpleasant time. I can't forgive and forget not for that. It's all over between us, and from the way I feel now, it won't be pretty either." He nodded. "I can hardly blame you, believe me." Then he asked, "What can Emily and I do to help?" Emily, she and Susan were friends too, though not as close as Brian and I. Look, could you keep this a secret even from Emily for the next few days? Of course. We don't usually keep anything from each other, but this is a special case. I won't say a word to her until you give me the okay. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. I sat down and thought for a moment. The only name I know of one of Susan's boys is Arnold Morrison, and I was hoping you could help me get in touch with him. He has no idea who I am, but he'll probably want to talk to you. Brian was a political writer, a columnist for Time magazine, but for nearly a decade he covered politics for the Cincinnati Enquirer newspaper and was respected by everyone in the local political scene. "I can do that no problem," he said, and we talked for a while about how to set things up. Then we discussed how I should behave around Susan. Brian advised me to suck it up and pretend I was business as usual, not to give her even a hint that anything was wrong until I was absolutely sure of everything. I shrugged and said, "I'm not sure I can do it, but I'll give it a try." And in fact, I succeeded almost as well as I had the night before. Again, thank God, Susan pressed against me, but she didn't demand sex. 2 days later, at 10:30 a.m., Brian and I were sitting in Arnold Morrison's large office looking across the table at him when he greeted Brian and me cordially. They greeted each other a little. "How do you do? What's old so-and-so doing?" And then he said pleasantly, "Well, Brian, what's on your mind?" He was a tall guy, just under 50, quite good-looking, though a little smarmy, as politicians often are. And he had the manner of many politicians. He seemed very sincere and very interested in you. Is that what attracted Susan? I had no idea. Arnie, I'm here on a very personal matter, and you can rest assured that we will keep our conversation confidential. I believe you know my friend Andy's wife, Susan Cullen. Morrison tried very hard to keep a straight face, but I could see his eyes widen slightly. He said quietly, "I think I've met her, Brian, but I don't remember exactly when or where." I leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, I don't intend to come off on you for this as long as you're completely honest with us, but I know what you did to my wife and I need to hear the whole story." To his credit, this guy turned out to be a pretty pleasant customer. He stared at us thoughtfully for a minute, but there was no panic on his face. Then he said, addressing Brian rather than me, "Is this completely off the record?" "Totally," Brian replied. "It's not for me to write anything. It's a private matter. It doesn't get written about, it doesn't get to your wife. It stays with the three of us. And you don't write it down?" "I don't record," Brian said. "Actually, I was recording. I had a small digital recorder in my jacket pocket, but neither of us had told Morrison about it." He sat like that for another minute, still calm and thoughtful. Then he sighed. "I get the feeling I didn't know the whole story either, Mr. Cullen," he said, looking at me. "I'm right that you didn't know about my activities with Mrs. Cullen." "Absolutely," I said. "Well," he said and stopped. "Well, yes, I had an affair with Susan. About 2 years ago, we met at some publisher's party at a reception for a new book coming out." He leaned forward, looking at me intently. "But I swear to you that she told me you knew all about it. Actually, she called it a game. She said that she and her husband, sorry you enjoyed her sleeping around, that she came home every time and told you all about it and it really enlivened your sex life. But she also made it clear that you pretend to know nothing of her affairs and that I should never mention it to you. It wasn't a problem since we're unlikely to meet. And anyway, I didn't want my wife to find out about it, so we were very careful." "How long have you been seeing her?" I asked him. To my surprise, I was completely calm, as if we weren't talking about the complete destruction of the most important relationship of my life. He thought for a moment, maybe 3.5 months. It started in late spring, and I remember she broke up with me around Labor Day. She said it was fun, but after a while, she and her husband weren't as interested in the same guy, and she needed to find someone else. It all seemed rather perverse to me, but Susan is a very beautiful woman. I never complained. He saw the pain on my face and said, "God, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that." "It's okay," I said. I believed him for thinking he was playing a silly game, not helping a woman cheat. As I told Greg, I could have done exactly the same thing in a similar situation. Probably would have if I'd been single. Where you gathered, different places, we had to be careful. Obviously, I'm in the public eye to some extent, but I'm on the council's public housing committee, and it's easy enough for me to get keys to some of the vacant apartments and buildings that the city controls. I was just saying that my staff was doing spot checks. We would usually meet during the week at lunchtime, and sometimes we'd spend the whole day together. "Any sleepovers or weekend getaways?" I asked. 2 or 3 times when Susan said you were out of town, he felt uneasy again. "I'd make up some story to tell my wife, and we'd spend nights at your house." "I'm sorry, Mr. Cullen." I nodded. I didn't need to ask him how the sex had gone, imagining it was bad enough. "Did she ever tell you about her other lovers? Or about how long she and I supposedly did it?" "I think she said I was the 4th or 5th guy she'd done it with. I remember her flattering me, saying, 'And you're the best of the lot,' or something like that." It was probably bullshit, but I didn't mind when I heard it. For another minute, we sat in silence. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" I asked him. "No, I don't think so." "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't hold a grudge against you," I replied. "You cheated on your wife, but that's your business. As for Susan, I can't blame you for believing her story." Morrison looked at Brian. "Confidential," he asked again. Brian nodded and stood up to shake Morrison's hand. "You have my word, Arnie. I'm sorry I had to put you in a tight spot, but my friend needs to know the truth." "Of course," he said, and politely escorted us to the exit. At the corner, Brian stopped and put his hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" I sighed. "Yeah, I knew what I was going to hear. It's just, well, it's one thing to know it, but it's another to get confirmation. The final nail in the coffin lid. Do you want to sit and talk or have lunch or even go beat a bucket of balls?" "No thanks, Brian. I'll be fine. I'll walk around the park until I'm hungry, then I'll grab a bite to eat and go back to work. But would you mind if I took you and Emily out to dinner tomorrow night? I'm starting to make some plans, and it would be great if you both could discuss them." Brian said that of course he would make arrangements with Emily. I thanked him again for his help with Morrison. God, it was great to have one true friend. As I got out of the car in the driveway, I thought, damn, another night where I have to pretend I don't know what my whore wife has been up to. And then I thought, why should I pretend? I'm not ready to confront her, but there's no reason not to make some noise. When I entered the kitchen, Susan was already preparing dinner for the table. She smiled radiantly and said, "Hi, honey, the food will be ready in a minute," and kissed me. I smiled and took a bottle of wine out of the refrigerator. For the first few minutes of dinner, she chatted about her day, but then noticed I wasn't talking much. "Rough day, Andy? You seem awfully quiet." "Yeah, actually," I said, looking at her. "That's pretty rough. I guess I've discovered that I can't always count on the people I thought I could count on." "Excuse me," she said with a serious look. "Is it something at work? I've heard you complain about Hank's staff a couple times recently. I don't think I should talk about that right now," I replied, leaving the question hanging. I sat looking directly at her for another moment, and then without saying a word, I got up to clear our plates. As I walked around the table, I noticed her looking at me anxiously. When I returned to the dining room with the 2 pieces of apple pie she had bought, her face was flushed, but she pulled herself together and thanked me with a warm smile. We ate dessert and silence at first, until Susan made a couple of awkward attempts to reopen the conversation, talking first about the new neighbors across the hall and then about the wonderful vacation one of her work friends had taken. When we were done with dessert, she got up and walked over to my chair, leaning over and putting her arms around me. She rubbed her cheek against mine and said, "Would you like some coffee? Or something else nice and hot?" If I had received a similar invitation on another night, not when I had just learned of her years of cheating on me, I would have been ecstatic. Instead, her offer only made me more furious. I stood up, breaking out of her embrace, and said, "No thanks. I have some paperwork to do." Without looking back, I left the room and walked down the hall to my office, leaving her to stare after me. I didn't know how shocked or frightened she was, but I knew I'd hurt her at least a little, and that was fine with me. I had planned to stay up late and come to the bedroom after she was asleep, but by about 10 o'clock I was tired and thought, to hell with this. Why should I avoid her? I went to get ready for bed, noticing that she was already in bed watching TV. I undressed, went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed without saying a word. She quickly turned off the TV, leaving only my bedside lamp in the room. Pressing herself against my chest, Susan murmured, "Would you mind a little love, Andy?" I turned away, rolling over so that my back was to her. As I did so, I said, "No, not tonight. Good night." I reached over and turned off the light. You can rest assured that I had never done anything like this before. I refused sex from Susan very rarely, a couple of times when I had a migraine or when I needed to finish a work project. Maybe 4 or 5 times throughout our marriage and never without explanation. So my behavior was the ultimate red flag, but Susan didn't say a word. She didn't ask, "Is everything all right?" or "Are you angry?" She didn't ask me anything because, of course, she was afraid of the ensuing conversation. Susan falls asleep easily, and most of the time I can hear her steady, quiet breathing within a couple minutes after lights out, whereas I always take a little longer. But not today. Half an hour later, she was still awake, but she still hadn't said a word. I grinned grimly to myself in the dark. Of course I hadn't slept either. I'd been lying awake for a long time, and I was very, very angry. An early rise, a quick shower, a cup of coffee, and I'm in the office by 7:30 without saying a word to Susan. I had a lot to do. I left a note on my boss's desk saying I'd like to talk to him as soon as he arrived, and then sat down to make lists of credit cards and bank accounts, possible movers, and other logistical things I'd need to take care of. At 815, Lionel poked his head out and said, "Good morning, Andy. You wanted to see me?" "Yes. Thank you, Lionel. Can we talk here for a minute?" I got up to close the door. I had worked with Lionel Brundage for almost 10 years. I considered him not only a friend, but a superior, and I decided I had to trust him. "Please keep this a complete secret, okay, Lionel? I'm afraid I have some bad news. I found out that Susan is cheating on me, and I'm going to leave her, as soon as I can. I wanted to get the name of that headhunter who called you about me last year. One of the executive search firms expressed interest in me, but the conversation never got very far, because at that point I was perfectly happy to stay where I was. Lionel was stunned and said so. In fact, the word Jesus figured prominently in his first remarks. But as we discussed what was happening, he overcame his shock and, as I had hoped, wanted to be helpful. By 10:15 that morning, I got through to the firm and spoke to the guy who had inquired about me last year. At 10:45, I faxed him my resume, and at 2:25 p.m., we were back on the phone discussing 3 possible positions that might be a good fit. The best one was a fundraising job for a large non-profit organization in Chicago. The job was a lot like the one I was doing now, but with a large support staff, and the pay was at least 20% higher. They had been trying to fill the position for almost 4 months and were ready to act quickly. I asked the headhunter to tell the non-profit that I was interested and ready to interview as soon as possible. I was getting ready to leave the office at about 550 when the phone rang and a large murmuring voice said, "Mr. Collin, I'm Ted Ruska from Global Resources in Chicago. I understand you may be interested in our fundraising position." We talked for almost half an hour, and at the end he invited me to Chicago for a meeting with the board of directors. The trip would take place in 2 days, and I gladly accepted the invitation. Dinner with Brian and Emily was both encouraging and painful. Encouraging because it reminded me that I had the support of 2 really amazing friends. Painful because I had to tell Emily the story, and that meant going through it again. She was stunned and full of sympathy and concern for me, and just furious at Susan. "It's a bitch," she said quietly, and I saw her fists clench. "I just can't believe." She looked at me, and seeing the pain on my face, her looks softened. "I'm so sorry, Andy," she said, taking my hand. "What can Brian and I do to help?" "Just be my friends," I said, wiping away a few tears. "I know I can get through this, but I have to admit that it really sucks to be me right now. But knowing that I have you 2 to talk to helps a lot." Brian squeezed my shoulder, and they both told me how much they wanted to help in any way they could. We had dinner, and I told them my plans to get a job out of town and just disappear. I wasn't interested in destroying Susan or publicly humiliating her. I just wanted out. Wanted her to wake up one day and suddenly find that her marriage was over, her husband gone. That would have been punishment enough. I told them about the potential job in Chicago. It sounds very promising, and if it works out, I'll almost certainly take it. And then I'll just disappear and let Susan go crazy trying to find me. I knew I couldn't hide forever, but I intended to explain my situation to my new employers and ask them to hold off on publicly announcing my employment for a month or so. With a new cell phone number and a new email account, and with Lionel's assistance at work, I was confident that I could go unrecognized for a couple of weeks, long enough to cause Susan some distress. So when things go to shit, I'm going to ask you guys to lie for me, because I'm sure you'll be the first people she calls. Just tell her you don't know anything about it. Emily smiled grimly, and this is despite the fact that I considered her one of my best friends. "Andy, you know you can count on us, and I look forward to telling her everything I think when she calls. That selfish cheating?" "Well," she said, a little embarrassed, "I guess you can tell what I think of what she did. Does that mean I can count on your loyalty to me, baby?" asked Brian teasingly. She playfully slapped his arm. "Yes, it is, and you better not do it behind my back, big guy, unless you want to get a penisectomy without anesthesia." We all burst into laughter, and our dinner turned into a relaxed evening full of humor and tenderness. I was I could almost forget the anger and suffering I had been carrying around for days. When I got home, it was late, and the bedroom was half dark, but Susan was still awake. She had sent me several friendly, light-hearted emails during the workday, but my only response was a short message saying I'd be home late after dinner. I didn't say with whom. "Hi, baby," came her voice in the darkness, delightfully relaxed and sleepy. I was painfully reminded of how much I had loved Susan and how beautiful I still thought she was. If only it had all been just a nightmare. If only I could believe that I still had a faithful, loving wife and dive into her arms. How was dinner? I missed you tonight. It was fine, I said bluntly. I ate with Brian and Emily. It's nice to have friends, people you can trust. She sat up. But why? She left the question unfinished. Like the night before, she was afraid to say anything that might lead to a conversation she didn't want to have, and so she stuck it out. Tough shit, I thought to myself. Saying nothing more, Susan waited silently while I got ready for bed, and when I lay down, she rolled over and took me in her arms. You let me down last night, baby. She purred in my ear, snuggling against me with her beautiful soft breasts. Any chance I'll get some of that good love tonight? I grinned to myself. I'm sorry, Susan, I said, pulling out of her embrace. I'm still tormented by the problem I told you about, and I'm really not in the mood. I could practically hear her brain working frantically. After a silence, she said, Okay, honey, I understand, but I hope we can make love soon. I miss you so much. She stroked my arms and shoulders lovingly for another moment, then moved to her side of the bed. Once again, it took her quite a while to fall asleep. And it took me even longer. Over the next few days, events unfolded rapidly. My trip to Chicago for an interview with the Global Resources Council went very well, and I accepted the job starting 10 days later. I immediately spoke with Lionel, who was sympathetic to the fact that I had given him so little notice. We agreed that I would continue to consult with him on a part-time basis for a month or so until my replacement got up to speed. I owed him a great debt of gratitude, and I wanted him to know that I would not let him down. 4 days later, I made a second trip to Chicago, and using the services of a real estate agent Ted Rusco knew, found a great one-bedroom apartment a few minutes from my new office. I signed the lease and then made a quick trip to the furniture store and bought everything I needed to furnish the apartment. I arranged for the delivery to be handled by the manager of my new building, so everything was ready for me when I arrived. I even made arrangements with Eileen Standbaugh, who will be my new administrative assistant, to purchase linens, towels, and some basic kitchen supplies. Eileen was happy to help, especially after I promised her dinner at the best restaurant in Chicago. By the time I returned to Cincinnati for the second time, there wasn't much left to do. I needed to clean out my office at the university, pack the clothes and other things I was taking with me from home, and make all the financial arrangements to separate my life from Susan's. Everything except the packing I could do in my office, and by Friday, it was all done. Susan didn't have much reason to worry about my trips out of town, since my job required me to travel quite often. But my coldness definitely made her worry, and I enjoyed watching her try to figure out what to do. She did not want to talk about what was troubling me, for she no doubt feared that I would suspect her of infidelity. So all she could do was be affectionate and loving, and my rude refusals of all her advances clearly upset and frightened her. Emily called me at work and informed me with a kind of malicious glee that Susan had called her to see if she knew anything about what was bothering me. I enjoyed every minute of it, Andy, she told me. I made Susan tell me about all your weirdness, how you don't respond to her affectionate hugs and kisses, deny her sex, hint that there's some problem, but don't talk about it. So I asked her, Is there anything you could have done that would have upset Andy in any way? And she said, panting, No, I don't know anything. And then I asked, Well, did you insist that he tell you what the problem was? She faltered and said she didn't want to put too much pressure on you, that she was sure you would tell her when you were ready. It was so obvious what she was afraid of. She was trying to get information out of me by keeping her own disgusting behavior a secret. I shared Emily's enjoyment of the call and asked her to keep me in the loop, and I let her know that I was ready to make my move on Monday. I continued to act mysterious and aloof that weekend. My own anger at Susan had certainly not diminished, and I was determined to make the last 2 days of my life as miserable as possible for her. I hardly spoke to her at all, and responded to her every warm or cordial suggestion with rude coldness. When she asked if we could take a walk on Saturday, It's such a lovely day, dear. I stared at her, and then said I didn't feel like it. When she offered many options for what we could do together on Saturday night, go out to dinner, watch a movie, or get together with friends, I said I wanted to stay home and watch TV. As she settled down next to me on the couch, I waited about 10 minutes until the end of the show we were watching and then stood up abruptly. "I just remembered I have a couple reports to finish," I said, and disappeared into my office. I went to bed late after Susan fell asleep and woke up Sunday morning to find her snuggled up against me. When I opened my eyes, she smiled at me and said, "Good for you. You're awake and the baby wants to play." She rolled over onto her back and tried to kiss me, but I held her back by putting both hands on her shoulders. "Susan stopped it," said I. "I'm not forcing you to have sex when you don't want to, and I'd appreciate it if you'd show the same consideration." I slid out from under her and got out of bed, reaching for my robe. She looked upset, but honey, we haven't made love in, I don't know, 2 weeks. I've done something to, you're mad at me? It was the closest she came to asking me a direct question about my behavior, a sign that she was getting desperate. "I don't know, Susan, you tell me. Is there anything you could do to make me angry with you?" I said it calmly but coldly. Silence. She looked down, then she said, "No, baby. Nothing that I can think of," and looked at me pleadingly, afraid to say anything else. "I guess we're done then," I said, and headed into the kitchen to make coffee. Susan must have been frightened by our conversation because she avoided me for most of the rest of the day. However, I heard her on the phone several times. I assumed she was talking to a friend or lover for all I know, trying to get help to figure out how to deal with me. While she was at the grocery store, I quickly called Greg and asked if he had talked to Susan. He told me that 2 days earlier she had spoken to him at work and asked if he had seen me lately. She said, "You seem distracted and distant," but she pretended she didn't know why. So I just told her I hadn't spoken to you. It seemed the easiest thing to do. And then she said she was looking forward to resuming the game with me, but it was probably best to wait a bit until she knew what was bothering you. I pretended to be disappointed, but of course I agreed. "Thanks, Greg. Things are about to go to shit. Please, whatever you do, don't let her know anything about our conversations, okay?" Greg promised again that he wouldn't say anything to her, and we got off the phone. Monday morning after breakfast, Susan came into the bedroom to finish getting dressed for work and was surprised to find me in sweatpants and sneakers. "Aren't you going to the office today, Andy?" "No, I have some business to take care of, so I took the day off." She looked at me for a moment. Then, almost timidly, she said, "Well, since you're not in a hurry, why don't we make love?" She smiled warmly and added, "I don't mind being a little late for work." That was all it took. I said, "No, I don't think so," and walked out of the bedroom without looking at her. I went down to the basement to find my suitcases and only came back up after I heard her car pull out of the driveway. By 11 a.m., I had packed everything I planned to take with me into 3 suitcases, plus a couple boxes of books and CDs. I called a cab which waited at the post office while I shipped the boxes to my apartment in Chicago and then took me to the airport. And by 7:30 p.m., I was finishing unpacking in my new place, after which I headed around the corner to eat pizza and drink beer. I made a discreet toast to the first day of the rest of my life. My new life, a life without Susan. Oh, I almost forgot. Just before I left the house, I wrote a short note to Susan, which I left on the kitchen table with my wedding ring and cell phone on top. The note said, "I found out about your game, so here's my game. It's called Goodbye, Traitor Whore." The first week at the new job was busy and tiring, and it was great because I missed Susan madly. Not that I wanted to be with her. That was over with. Whenever I thought of her, I was overcome with rage. I marveled at the grotesque perfection of how she had betrayed me. But just because I was angry and hated her to my core didn't mean I didn't miss her. I loved her for so many years, loved everything about her. Those feelings don't just disappear. Instead, they mix with new ones, love and hate swirling together like a washing machine. All in all, I was very glad that Global Resources was loading me up so much. When Friday came, I was grateful to just get home, watch part of a ball game on TV, and go to bed. But it was a rough weekend. I was new to Chicago, didn't know a soul except my new coworkers, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I was once again a single man. Well, not legally, but in every other way. I knew I would have to begin the process of meeting people, making friends, and trying to find a new woman in my life, and that prospect was extremely discouraging. The best part of these 2 days was the conversation I had with Brian and Emily on Sunday. They were supportive and eager to hear how I was doing. I gave them my new address and phone number, once again sworn to secrecy, and Emily was eager to tell me about meeting Susan. She called us Monday night around lunchtime. She was almost hysterical. She was crying so hard I could hardly understand her, but eventually I could make out what she was saying. He's gone. And he's gone. She wouldn't calm down, so I told her I was going there. When I arrived, she was in a terrible state. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared from crying. She could barely speak. I got her a drink and then sat down and played the part of the sympathetic friend to the end. God, that was fun. I let her tell me all about how she came home from work and found you gone and your wedding ring lying on the table. I asked her why on earth you did that. Did you leave a note or anything? And then, said Emily gleefully, she looked at me and cried still harder. And at last she said, "Oh, Emily, I have cheated on him." I pretended to be completely shocked and said something like, "No, Susan, you didn't do that." And I got really angry and got up and walked around the kitchen, stopping every now and then to look at her. She looked guilty and scared. Finally, I said, "I'm sorry, Susan, but I just can't stay here right now. I love both you and Andy, and I can't believe you did this to him. He was the best, most loving." And then I just said, "We'll talk in a few days when I've calmed down," and left. Left her right there in the kitchen with tears in her eyes. Even over the phone, it was easy to hear the satisfaction in Emily's voice. I knew Susan would be frantic to find me, and frankly, I hoped that not being able to find me would drive her crazy. The fact that I missed her so much only fueled me. How dare she, the woman I'd given so much of myself to, act so incredibly selfish and make me so damn miserable? Over the next 2 weeks, I kept in touch with Brian and Emily. They were like my lifeline, letting me talk about things in Chicago, my new job, and sometimes how lonely and empty I felt. They patiently listened to me and advised me to hang in there. They were wonderful. Susan called them every day and asked if they knew anything about where I had disappeared to. According to them, there was desperation in her voice. I also quickly called Lionel, who told me that Susan had come to see him the day after I left. She nearly fainted when she learned that I had quit my job and left no address. After my 3rd week in Chicago, I flew back to Cincinnati at Brian and Emily's invitation and spent the weekend with them. It was a great chance to relax and take my mind off the pain I was carrying around. At dinner on Saturday, Emily told me about her last visit to Susan. She came to see me on Thursday, still trying to find you, still totally desperate. She's talking about hiring a private investigator or someone else to find you. She feels like if she can talk to you, she can understand you and you'll forgive her. I raised my eyebrows. Unlikely, I'd say. But I'm interested to hear her side of the story. Did she tell you about it? Emily's eyes sparkled. I said, "Look, Susan, you've been whining and moaning about losing Andy for 3 weeks now. We've been friends for years. When the hell are you going to tell me what you really did, how bad it was? And she told you? Well, Emily, I'm all ears. Spill it. I learned a hell of a lot about my wife that night, and none of it I wanted to know." Emily began by telling me about Susan's first affair. With some charming British man she'd met at a book party. He'd chatted with her throughout the event and then invited her out for drinks afterward. Emily told him that she was a married woman and couldn't just leave with him. But she didn't blow him off. She asked him what hotel he was staying at and then said she would meet him at the bar in an hour. Then they met up, had a drink, went up to his room, and went to bed together. I sat staring out the window. After all, this wasn't news. I knew she'd been having fun with me for years. She said, "Why?" I asked her about it, believe me. And she got embarrassed and replied, "I was bored. I know that's no excuse, Emily, but it's true. Andy and I had a great life, but it was the same thing all the time. Nothing special or different, so predictable, you know? And then this incredible guy with this great accent showed up, and I thought, wow, this is going to be a blast." She said it was a lot of fun, and that she made sure to do it with you next week, and it was better than usual. And then she said she told herself it was a win-win situation. She could have fun every now and then, secretly, discreetly, and it would spice up her sex life with you at home, and everyone would be better off for it. Can you believe that shit? Over the next hour or so, Emily told me the whole story. Susan had gradually gotten into the habit of finding a boyfriend every couple months. At first, it was a one-time thing, but then the 5th or 6th guy turned out to be amazing in bed, and she wanted to meet him again. Their affair lasted 3 months until he got engaged to the woman he was dating. According to Emily, Susan realized that it gets even better after the first time. So her new plan became short-term affairs, 6, 10, maybe 20 times with one guy. "What about the game?" I asked. She said it happened when the guy she was sleeping with started showing possessive tendencies. It occurred to her that one of her lovers might get too attached to her and threaten to tell you about it. So she decided that if they thought she was sleeping with you with your knowledge and permission, they would realize that she would never leave you or become vulnerable to blackmail. I must say she was pretty darn proud of herself for that little idea. She even giggled a little when she told me. Brian brought me another beer and I sipped it as I pondered dark things. Everything Emily was telling me wasn't much different from what I'd imagined, and yet it was indescribably painful to listen to. To feel like such an idiot feeling that I'd so cruelly misjudged the person I loved and trusted more than anything else in the world. How could I have been such an idiot? She was bored. Geez, don't all married couples get a little bored, a little stale? But what's the right way to deal with it? Come to me and say, "Honey, let's find some fun ways to liven things up. A vacation, anything, but not having fun with other guys." I don't remember ever being bored with her. No, Susan decided to revitalize her sex life, not mine. As I was getting ready to leave for Chicago on Sunday, Brian asked me what I was going to do about Susan. "Are you just going to let her twist in the wind and wonder what happened to you? Or do you plan to somehow end it once and for all?" I shook my head. "To tell you the truth, I'm not sure yet. Maybe one thing and then another. Maybe I'll just let it drag on until she finds me and then have a nice little surprise afterward." I told him what I was thinking and he grinned. "Sounds just perfect, Andy. I just wish I could be there for it." To my surprise, it was several more weeks before Susan figured out where I was. Brian told me on the phone that she had hired someone to look for me, so I guess that's what she did. I didn't care. But on Thursday, I came home from work and found a long, rambling message from Susan. "Thank God I found you, baby. I'm so sorry, so very sorry. I love you more than anything in the world. Please give me a chance to explain. I miss you so much. I'll do anything to make it up to you. You know you're the only man I love." And another 5 minutes, all in roughly the same vein. There wasn't one word that wasn't completely predictable, not one word that didn't make me angry. I don't know what she expected. You can't cheat on your husband time and time again over the years and then say, "Oh, it's my fault," and he'll forgive you and take you back. I'm sorry, Susan, but that can't happen. So it seemed like it was time to determine what to do next. I knew she'd keep calling. Just ignoring her wasn't going to work in the long run. The next day, I took my assistant Eileen out for a long lunch. She had become a good friend of mine and already knew most of the unfortunate story of how I had unexpectedly come to work at Global Resources. She was a pleasant, middle-aged lady married with 3 children and very smart. In fact, the best assistant I'd ever had. I told her what I was planning for Susan, and she threw back her head and laughed. "I love it, Andy. I can't think of anything more appropriate." She laughed again. She seemed to like my idea. "Yeah, but I need help finding someone. I don't really—" "Let me try, okay?" She interrupted me. "I have a couple ideas. Before you do anything, give me a few days." I raised my eyebrows perplexively. "Really?" She nodded, smiling, and I said, "Well, okay, but it's hardly the kind of thing a guy would normally ask his administrative assistant to do for him." We both laughed. Susan kept calling. At least every day for the next 2 weeks, her messages were shorter, but there was nothing new in them, and I certainly wasn't interested in talking to her, let alone forgiving her or letting her back into my life. On Monday, as I was packing and getting ready to leave work, Eileen stopped by to see me. "It's all set. I have the perfect one for you. Just let me know the day and time, and I'll give her your address." I looked skeptical. Will I be happy with this person? For that matter, Eileen, who the hell is this person, and how did you talk her into it? "That's not exactly," she said with a smile. "It's going to be perfect, and she really wants it. I told her about your situation, and she's looking forward to it. And you won't tell me who it is?" "No," she said, grinning like a treasure cat. "But trust me, boss, you won't be disappointed." The next day, I left a message on Susan's answering machine. "It's me. If you really want to explain, you have one chance. This Saturday, 1 o'clock in the afternoon at my apartment in Chicago. Don't show up early and don't be late. I'll give you 1 hour. Here's the address. Leave me a return message to confirm you're coming." That evening, I didn't pick up the phone when it rang, but listen to Susan leave me an excited message. "Oh my goodness, thank you, baby, thank you. I love you so much. Of course, I'll be there on Saturday. Thank you for this chance. I know I can understand you. I'm so sorry I hurt you, and I want to spend the next 60 years making it up to you, etc., etc., etc." The next day, Wednesday, I spoke to Eileen. I made an appointment for 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. "Can you ask your mystery woman to be at my place no later than 12? "Of course," she said, "but you have to promise to call me and tell me the whole story when it's over. That will be my reward." Emily told me over the phone how excited Susan was. "I swear, Andy, she has no idea about anything. She really thinks she's going to get you back, like all she has to do is tell you how sorry she is. Honestly, I don't understand how I could have been so deceived. After all, we've been friends for almost 15 years, and we talked about everything. Our husbands, our jobs, our families. And now that I recognize how selfish and cruel she can be, even if she can't see it, of course, I can only wonder how blind I was." I laughed a little bitterly. "Look, Emily, how do you think I feel? I've been married to her all this time. I guess the real lesson is that people like you, Brian and me, decent, trusting, caring for others, usually make the mistake of assuming that the rest of the world is just like us. And Susan doesn't. Saturday morning, I cleaned up my apartment to make it look right. I didn't want to look or feel like a victim. I wanted the apartment to look like the home of a happy single guy. Newspapers had been thrown in the trash. Books were neatly arranged on the shelves. Everything was wiped and cleaned. There were even flowers and a vase on the table. When the doorbell rang at 12 noon, I opened the door with some apprehension. "Hi, please." "What? Christina? Hi, Andy." She giggled. Maybe I should say surprise, Andy. Christina Hansen worked at Global Resources as a program specialist. She was one of the first people I met when I started working there. She was about 30 or so she was about 8 years younger than me, and she was just stunning. Christina was slender, with black hair, and the most amazing green eyes I had ever seen. She was elegant and classy, yet amazingly casual and friendly with people. She was simply one of the most beautiful women I have ever met. And of course, I was awed by her looks when I first met her, but I was also blown away by what Susan was doing to me. And I was in the middle of my first couple of days at a new job and in a new city, and was busy trying to remember the names of the other 12 people I had been introduced to at the same time. I certainly thought of her often. We saw each other several times a week in passing or at senior staff meetings, and she was always cordial and cheerful. She seemed to like me, though I couldn't be sure if it was just her natural sociability and friendliness. I knew she wasn't wearing a wedding ring, but it was almost impossible for a gorgeous woman like Christine not to have a boyfriend. So I put her out of my mind as more than just a coworker I liked, and who I actually enjoyed looking at. It didn't even occur to me to ask Eileen about her and whether she was seeing anyone. Now, as she looked around my apartment with an approving expression on her face, I was at a complete loss. "Christine, Eileen told you about today, right? About my wife and what I was planning?" She smiled broadly at me. "Of course." She gestured to the shopping bag she'd brought with her and said, "Everything I need is in here. But you," I was still unsure, still flabbergasted, actually. "You realize that you're going to be, this time." Christina laughed and gently stroked my cheek with the back of her hand. "Yeah, Andy, I get it. Eileen told me about your situation, what you found out about your wife and all that." She began to look more serious and continued. Let's just say I went through something similar with my ex-fiancé a little over a year ago, and it's not hard for me to understand how you feel." "I'm sorry," I said. "I had no idea. Well, it's not so new anymore, I'm over it. But it was awful back then, and I'd give a lot to be able to shove it back down your throat the way you're going to do it to Susan." She laughed. "So how do you want to set this up?" I suggested lunch first, and we spend about half an hour eating sandwiches at my kitchen table and just getting to know each other. I already knew how attractive Christina was, but this lunch confirmed that she was also very smart, funny, and thoughtful. I wondered if she would go out with me, but that was a question for another day. When it was about 12:45, I said, "Christina, if you're sure you're ready to do this, maybe it's time for you to go to the bedroom." "I'm ready," she said brightly. We figured out what our line would be. Then she leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "This is going to hurt Andy. She's been a part of your life for a long time. Don't expect it to be easy, but I'll do my best, I promise you that." And with a smile, she disappeared into my bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. I smiled to myself as I put the dishes away and waited for Susan to arrive. It was a very pleasant surprise to see Christine and not a stranger at the party tonight. At 12:58, the doorbell rang, and I tried to prepare myself for what was to come. Susan smiled bravely. She looked scared but beautiful at the same time. She wore an outfit she knew I liked, had her makeup done, and seemed to have a new hairdo. "Hi, Andy," she said quietly, as if intending to hug me. I stepped back quickly, however, inviting her in. "Hi, Susan," I said quietly. "Would you like something to drink?" I fidgeted in the kitchen for a moment, getting sodas for her and myself. I was frustrated by how fast my heart was beating, how much I was caught up in the mixture of love and rage inside me. I knew I needed to calm down and find a way to deal with it. When we sat down, she leaned across the table, looking at me appealingly, and tried to take my hands, but I kept them on my side of the table. "Okay, Susan, you're here and I'll listen to you, even though I don't think you deserve it." She took a deep breath. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I did wrong, terribly wrong, and I know I hurt you so much. I was so selfish, so blind and stupid. Okay, that's enough," I said, interrupting her and raising my hand. "I don't want to hear how sorry you are, how much you love me, that it was a mistake, that I had nothing to do with it, that it was just sex. Do you understand? Don't treat me like an idiot. You've been having fun with other men, a whole lot of men behind my back for years. Am I right?" Shocked by my fury, she nodded her head hesitantly. "But honey, Do you remember our wedding vows?" I asked aggressively, again not letting her finish. "To renounce everything else? Do you remember agreeing to that, Susan?" She nodded again, her face pale. She didn't seem to have expected our conversation to go this way, though I couldn't imagine why not. What the hell did she think I was going to say? "No problem, honey. Okay, we swore lifelong fidelity to each other, and then at some point you decided I screwed it and started having fun with anyone. Tell me, Susan, how many men were there?" "I don't know, baby. 10, 20, 50. It was I don't know, probably 20. She looked very concerned. "How many times have you betrayed me?" I sat and waited, realizing I was breathing hard. My face was probably flushed too. "I don't know, baby." She looked at me, hoping for sympathy. Her eyes were starting to water. "Come to think of it, Susan, do the math. I'm in no hurry. I think it's probably about a couple hundred." She looked down, unable to return my angry stare. "Okay, let's call it 200. That's a nice round number. Tell me how many of those times were in our house, in our bed? In our marital bed, I practically screamed." Very quietly, she said, I don't know, Andy, maybe 30. There was silence. "So now that we've sorted that out, so we know exactly what we're talking about, please feel free to explain, Susan. Please tell me why, after what you've done, I should waste my time being in the same room with you. Because I love you, Andy. You're the only man She was already crying, sobbing between words. "The only man I've ever loved. You mean everything to me?" I let her talk and cry and plead with me about her love for me. How she was selfish and had made a terrible mistake. She thought I would never know that she didn't mean to hurt me. As if didn't mean to hurt me was okay. It was just as I had predicted. Not a single word she said had any meaning other than the conviction that she was an infinitely more narcissistic and self-absorbed individual than I had previously realized. After a while, I wasn't listening to her anymore. Her voice became background noise for my own sad thoughts about the years I had invested in our relationship, the dreams of our old age together. The rage inside me mingled with sadness. What a waste, and I realized that I would never know why she did it. She didn't seem to know it herself. She couldn't give me any reason that made sense to me except pure, almost psychopathic selfishness. I lifted my head. It was 205 on the kitchen clock, and I didn't know how much more I could take, or want to. I said loudly, "I think we're done here, Susan. I have nothing more to say." Susan began to cry again. "But Andy, I can't believe you." There was a noise behind us from the direction of my bedroom, and we both turned to look. My jaw dropped, and I vaguely heard Susan gasp. "Baby, you said you'd be done with her in an hour. When are you going back to bed?" It was Christina speaking in a low, relaxed voice. I turned around to look at Susan, who was frozen in her chair, stunned. Her face was pale, and she seemed to have somehow retracted into herself as if she had become smaller and older in a few moments. She began to shake her head back and forth, repeating no, no, over and over. I stood up. Christina's right, Susan. I said I'd give you an hour, and as you can see, I'm a bit busy. Or anyway, I'll be back in a few minutes. I smiled coldly at her, watching her struggle to get to her feet. Andy, I began Susan, but then stopped. She looked at Christina again, and then at me. I didn't know that you, her voice broke, and she just stared at me, frozen. And without another word, she stood up, crying quietly, walked to the apartment door, opened it, and disappeared into the hallway. I closed the door, then turned and looked at Christina. Christina, I said almost reverently, you are the most incredibly beautiful woman I have ever seen in my life. She smiled, ducking her head slightly. Thanks, Andy. I could see her eyes were full, like she was about to cry. You destroyed her, I said. She knew she was in over her head. Thank you very much. As I continued to stare at her, I could barely speak. Susan had practically disappeared from my thoughts. It helped me too, you know, she said in a funny secondary way, like I got Harris, my ex-fiancé, back. I'm glad, I said, and then I'm sorry, I just can't stop looking. Do you want to go back in there and change? She just looked at me, and something in her eyes changed. Actually, she said, I was wondering if you could help me with this. I sometimes have trouble getting this thing off. She laughed at my surprised expression. I'm serious, Andy. This feels right, like the next thing that needs to happen here. For both of us, making love with Christina was like a miracle, like a dream, only very real. After maybe half an hour, she mumbled that she had to go and got out of bed. I started to get up, but she gently pulled me against her. No, it's okay, Andy, just rest. I didn't know this was going to happen in case you were wondering. She told me, but after I heard you in her talk, I decided I wanted it. I decided it was the right thing to do. Thank you, Christina. That was the most loving, most generous, and beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. Smiling, she replied, I did it for me too, Andy. And you've done a lot of good for me, and not just for my ego. And with those words, she kissed me again, said no, don't get up again, and disappeared from the apartment. I slept for several hours, exhausted from both the confrontation with Susan and the extraordinary session with Christina. I woke up around 5 o'clock and wandered aimlessly around the apartment, putting things in order, a little dazed and pensive. Suddenly, without allowing myself to think about the questionable reasonableness of my actions, I found Christina's number and called her. Hey, it's Andy, I said, suddenly nervous. Hi, Andy, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I hope it wasn't too weird for you, I said, not knowing where to put myself. You've been so kind, and I just needed to thank you again. And tell you how special you are. It wasn't weird for me at all, she said, just surprising. I'm not usually this spontaneous, and well, I guess what I mean to say is to let you know that I'm not a do-that all the time, just go jumping into bed with men like that. I never would have thought. I could tell that he was special, I finished unconvincingly. Listen, I said, pitching forward, would you like to have dinner with me tonight? There are so many great restaurants in Chicago that I've never tried, and I'd love to take you to one of them. There was a short pause, and I waited, suddenly seized with terror. After the longest 5 seconds of my life, she replied, Yeah, actually, that would be really nice, Andy. I'd love to. We talked a bit about what food, what restaurant, when and where I would pick her up. It seemed like it was really going to happen, and I could feel my whole body smiling. Then she said, Andy, after supper, is it okay if I come over and stay with you tonight? I invited Brian and Emily over repeatedly, but it took another 3 weeks before they were able to find a free week and to come visit me in Chicago. They stayed at a nice hotel downtown and let me show them around. The lake, the museums, Wrigley Field Stadium, which Brian desperately wanted to see. Saturday night, we were having drinks at the Fairmont Hotel bar while waiting for a table for dinner. I was telling them some of the details of my last conversation with Susan, not that they hadn't heard most of it over the phone, but we were all enjoying my retelling. Suddenly, a hand was on my shoulder. I jumped up, smiled at the most beautiful pair of green eyes I had ever seen, kissed Kristen and said, Emily and Brian, meet Christine Hansen. Christine, this is Emily and Brian O'Halloran. They greeted each other as I helped Christina sit down and ordered her drink. We started to make polite conversation, but I noticed that Brian was silent, just looking at Christina. After a couple minutes, he interrupted me in the middle of the story. He gestured at Christina and said, "My God, Andy, you landed on your feet for once." We all parted ways, and thankfully no one laughed harder than Emily. She knew she wasn't as beautiful as Kristen, but she also knew that Brian adored her, and his admiration for Kristen didn't bother her one bit. As we walked to dinner and the two women walked a few steps ahead of us, Brian said quietly to me, "Are you two really, dating?" I nodded. So far, so good. Truth be told, I can hardly believe it myself. And she's not just beautiful. She's the whole package, generous, funny, affectionate. Brian had already heard some of the story, particularly that Christina was also going through cheating. He said, "Well, I guess your shared tragedy was a kind of good fortune, almost a happy accident." I don't know about tragedy. I think it's more casual. Something like we've both been screwed over by selfish assholes. "Well, never mind," he said. He put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm really happy for you, Andy. Things seem to be working out really well, more than well." I smiled at him as we moved toward our table behind two charming women chatting together. "I'm living the dream, buddy," I said.